Welcome to the AQA YouTube channel. To navigate through the video, you can select specific chapters or subjects of the video. Enjoy watching and remember to subscribe.
So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along, and special welcome to Leanne Rees, who has agreed to join us today to talk about her PhD. I think most of you probably know Leanne, but she's been a physio with the Victorian Spinal Cord Service for many years now, and has more recently been involved with the Spinal Community Integration Service, so working with people once they leave the inpatient phase of their rehab. The other thing I think is worth mentioning about Leanne, because it's topic, I forget the word, it's timely anyway, is that you've been an assessor for the Paralympics. Anyway, I think, Leanne, you might want to fill out the rest of the picture, but thanks for coming along. And Leanne's presenting on her PhD thesis, which is on how media represents spinal cord injury.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Sal. I think that covers my background, but I do know most people I've met most at some stage in my career working here at Talbot. So I haven't prepared a PowerPoint, only that I got a bit busy and didn't have time, so sorry about that. But I've got some notes here of some things that I thought would be good to go over. But I thought it'd just be a really wonderful opportunity for it to be a discussion. If you've got any questions along the way, just please fire away, let me know, and we can go in whichever direction you like. But to give you some background, I've been a physio here, I think it's been for nearly 20 years. I've worked in rehab and acute and now in the community. And throughout that time, it's always really struck me, whenever there's been a story in the media on spinal cord injury, the impact that has had on people that I've been working with. As an example, working in rehab, whenever there's been a story on the latest research, it often would bring up lots of questions. But then working in the community, when I was helping people integrate back into their lives, kind of realizing that the only time you would see someone with disability or spinal cord injury for that matter on TV was every 4 years when the Paralympics was on. There was kind of never any other opportunity or never any other images that would come through. And that really struck me. And it's that common saying that you hear a lot now, you can't be what you can't see. And I've always felt for people when how is it that they can envisage doing something whenever you can't see it? And that's just the power of the peer and network that you guys bring, because then they actually get to meet the people. But it's just not the person with spinal cord injury, it's their family and friends as well. So for my master's in public health, I did a project just looking at how Channel 7 broadcasts the Paralympics and Olympics, and that gave me a taste for the role of media in disability. And so 2 years ago now, I got to start this PhD, which is specifically looking at how spinal cord injury is reported and portrayed, but obviously that can also expand out into disability as well. So I just thought I could tell you about the 2 projects that I've done already and the 3rd one that I'm doing this year. And then if you've got any questions, just to let me know. Does that sound okay? Yep, nods. Oh, everyone's on mute. Thinking, oh, there's silence. Very good. So my first project, because kind of whilst I felt that maybe the portrayal in media wasn't great, I kind of had to prove it. So my first project, where I actually looked at a newspaper from 1950. So I pulled out all the articles that appeared in a newspaper from 1950 to 2018, because I was really interested to see how the reporting may have changed over time. And so with this particular study, I managed to get 1,049 articles, and then I studied those articles to see what the themes were. probably to no surprise, traumatic spinal cord injury was mentioned way more than non-traumatic. As a comparison, traumatic was mentioned 542 times. And could anyone guess how many times non-traumatic was mentioned? Georgina? Oh, once. A little bit more. 38. There were 38 mentions. And, you know, already for me, it's like, yeah, no, even before I started working in spinal, I didn't even know non-traumatic spinal cord injury existed. And so I'm not surprised that, yeah, it's becomes a bit of an unknown, but we can look at what media don't report on it at all. When I analysed the articles, by far the most common theme were the articles are about the cause. So an article would talk about how someone had an accident, and then it would talk about the injury. The next round of articles was centred around participation, which were mainly articles around sport. And then the third theme was around the socio-economic cost, so the cost involved in having a spinal cord injury. And then when we're looking at the context of those articles, they were certainly centred around tragedy. So there was very much a tragic narrative that sat with those articles, or there was an overachievement. So it would, as you can imagine with the Paralympic articles that centred on someone who'd gone to the Paralympics, there was very much an inspiration narrative that went with those articles. And then the third one was a financial burden. So what was really obvious to me with all these, so just over 1,000 articles, that there were these two polar narratives that existed. Either you're very tragic, there's something that's very tragic that's happened, or you're overachieving. So you're going on to the Paralympics, and there was nothing in between. And so I started to think, it's like, oh, okay, this is the only time you're seeing spinal cord injury in the media. I wonder how that actually shapes people's understanding of it, or what's then the impact of that, which is what took me on to the second study. I thought I might just show you the poster. Okay.
Yeah, that's working.
Great. So this is just a poster. I don't know if the font's a bit small for you to be able to read it on your screens. So this is a poster that I presented at ISCOS last year, which is a summary of the newspaper analysis that I did.
Sorry, Leanne, can you just make that a bit larger, please?
Here we go. Bigger again?
No, that's great for me. If anyone else needs it bigger.
Oh, there we go. But I just wanted to show you some of the quotes that used to exist. I mean, thankfully we don't see quotes like this anymore, but this was this one from 1970. A 20-year-old girl whose life expectancy was said to be about 35 to 40 years and whose marriage prospects were extremely remote was awarded $86,000 damages today as a paraplegic. And I just thought that's a bit tragic. Marriage prospects were extremely remote. And this one here was equivalent about the pension. Among those declared ineligible were paraplegics, people who were bedridden, and those who had been told by their doctors that they would die if they attempted to work again. It just astounds me that there used to be a narrative like that. But does anyone have an idea of why there was that kind of narrative? For me, when I was reading, oh, sorry.
Yeah, just ignorance.
Yeah, ignorance. But you know what? It's before there was compulsory third party. So it was when there was a system where people would go to court and sue people more so for damages. So the lawyers would be putting on this really tragic story in order to reap the most money. That's how I interpret it, because a lot of the stories I were reading were court reports. And so it kind of made a little sense to me on why such grim pictures were being painted. It was in order to be able to maybe get the most cost. So thankfully we don't see that now, because now we have a compensation system that people don't have to go to court so much. That's just my little theory from reading the articles. But yeah, it's good. But I think for sure, and so Gary, you're saying with ignorance is that, and this, actually I'm probably giving it away, but this year what I've done is interviewed journalists to find out their experience when they've done a story on spinal cord injury. And I think it is a level of ignorance, but it's also understanding that a journalist, as there was a really great quote, you know, they start the day at 8 o'clock knowing nothing, and by the end of the day they're supposed to be the expert in that particular topic. And I think that's where part of the problem lies, is that journalists cover a big array of topics and they do it very quickly, so it doesn't actually allow them much time to get deep into the story and maybe to take their blinkers off and see what's actually out there. So it's a really good point to make.
I don't know why else I want to sensationalise stories, because, you know, it's making them far more dramatic. Means that, you know, you get more people reading it. So
yeah, and they all talk about that hook of trying to, like, even the journalists would talk about, they've written an article and they've kept to language that they think is appropriate, but then the editor will come in and then just change the headline, and it doesn't match to the rest of the article, but they've used that headline. And my other theory then is, because the editor has probably would never have met the subject, you know, they're so far removed from the story, they've got no personal investment to actually make it any better, because they're just thinking business. Because at the end of the day, it is business. It's having people click on your website or to be reading your paper. And I think that's one of the other challenges as well. So that newspaper that I studied was the Canberra Times, which probably wasn't the best newspaper to study because it's not the most mainstream. It probably would have been good to do something like the Sydney Morning Herald or the Age, but it was the only newspaper that I could get access to dating back to the 1950s. And the reason why I started in the 1950s is because it wasn't until after World War II that spinal cord injury was actually treated and people were rehabilitated. And the spinal cord injury, the first rehab service here in Australia, which I think was in Perth, wasn't built until the 1940s. So I thought if I could capture the 1950s to now, it would paint a nice picture of how spinal cord injury is seen in our society. All right, so that was my first. Any questions about the newspaper analysis? So having done that, the next project was to really talk to people with spinal cord injury and to find out, well, what is their perception of the portrayal, and then what's the impact. And a couple of people on the call here were part of that, so I thank them for being part of that study. But I interviewed 24 people. Just by coincidence, 12 had paraplegia and 12 had quadriplegia. So that wasn't on purpose, but it was nice to get that spread. I had 6 women and 18 men. So that's probably a bit representative of the community. I probably didn't have as many non-traumatic as I would have liked. I just had 3 people who were non-traumatic as opposed to then 21 who were traumatic. And then I had 21 people who were full-time wheelchair users, 1 person that, 22 people who used a wheelchair full-time, 1 used a wheelchair half the time, and 1 person walked full-time. So I probably would have liked to have a few more incomplete, but I'm really happy with it. Getting 24 people is a very good number, and definitely after interviewing that many, the themes were repeating themselves. So that's kind of the the goal is in making sure that you've reached what they call data saturation. So if you're starting to hear the same messages, then you know that you've got a good number of people. So that study was, really interesting. It was so good. Each interview probably lasted about 75 minutes. So it was a good amount of time talking to people. I transcribed each of the interviews by myself. So that was a great thing to do in lockdown last year. I think that pretty much passed lockdown 2 the whole time, and then analyze that data. And actually, I can share the infographic. Probably be easier to speak to that. Share the screen again. This is just a summary. Is that okay? Can people see that all right? So most definitely, the people that I spoke to had told me that media portrays spinal cord injury, what we described as a very narrow lens. So it's those polar narratives that came through in the newspaper analysis that I did, that people were either considered or either portrayed as pitied or they were inspiring, and there was nothing in between. And that people then the people that I interviewed felt that this was inaccurate, and then it potentially caused a misunderstanding of what spinal cord injury is. And it can be summarised in these 3 statements: that the public assumes that spinal cord injury is something that can be overcome. And this is just a quote from someone, that people feel that you just have to work hard and you'll be able to walk again. Potential quality of life is overlooked, that on the whole people generally thought that they were unhappy, and that the other experiences of spinal cord injury are overshadowed. So the public just think it's all about an inability to walk or a struggle to walk, with no understanding of the other impairments and challenges that come with spinal cord injury. And I guess before moving any forward, does that kind of reflect how your experiences? Getting some nods.
Yep.
I mean, if I were to ask the group now how you think media portrays spinal cord injury, do you feel it's a bit the same, that there's these 2 polar narratives and really there's nothing in between?
Yeah, my experience is the hero narrative seems to be quite a lot in the media these days, you know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
yeah,
mm-hmm.
and that's it's seen as something remarkable that someone would get out of bed in the morning and go to work. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, there is that no between all that feel sorry factor, like a lot of times in reality shows, The Voice or whatever this reality show is, that person has an attachment of hardship or a family that's disabled or something that's got hardship attached to it.
Mm-hmm,
And sort of media do that a lot. Yeah.
mm-hmm.
But to be fair to them, and not to be fair to them, because it's impossible to be fair to the media. I don't want to be fair to them, but they actually do that with able bodies as well. They do that with everyone. They sensationalize everyone or overly dramatize everyone's situation.
I think, Leanne, an interesting thing is during these COVID times that people have been limited in their mobility may see us in a different perspective, and that there's a change, a sort of a big change, because we can participate as well as they can in Zoom meetings and things like that. Mm-hmm. So they see that we have a different type of outlook on life in doing things. Well, that's what I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great.
Leanne, and this might be a discussion we can pick up later on, because I don't want to derail your presentation, but those themes about spinal cord injury can be overcome, quality of life is overlooked.
Yeah, I'll share the screen again. Yeah,
it's only about walking. I think from the peer support perspective, it's worth being present to the thought that that's the thinking that people with a new injury would be coming in with. So they're and I guess we see a lot of the, you know, I just got to do my physio and I'll walk out of here again. We get a lot of that, but those bits about not expecting a quality of life and being surprised by it's not just my legs that don't work are things that you know, I guess people who are newly injured are dealing with, and that's where that peer support's really important to support them through that.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Sal. And I mean, and then overall, the people that I interviewed described that as a result, they felt that from the public there was unreasonable assumptions and expectations about them or about spinal cord injury. So it really has me thinking, and it takes me back to when I used to work more so in rehab, but then also on the acute ward. You know, certainly when someone has sustained their injury in that immediate time, you know, what are the expectations and assumptions did they have about spinal cord injury? And then they're moving into rehab, the next phase, and what are their expectations and assumptions then? And not only them, but their family and friends as well. And then moving on to the community, what are the expectations and assumptions? But then also of their employer, you know, what expectations and assumptions do they have? And I think about even health professionals who are starting to work with them, who may not work with people with spinal cord injury very often. What do they assume or expect? And we know that media is so powerful, and we know that it can have, like the literature to date has shown that certainly in the area of disability, media can have an impact on people's lives. So I think COVID's really brought to light how influential media can be. So I think it's confident, you know, I think unless you know someone with spinal cord injury, probably all you do know is what you've read or seen in media. So maybe it's a safe assumption that anyone who has acquired an injury really, as you've just summarised, Sal, maybe think it's something that can be overcome. The quality of life can be overlooked, and those other experiences are overshadowed.
One more, Leanne, is the massive, it seems to be overlooked, the massive difference between the various kinds of quadriplegia, and people don't get incomplete and complete. And so they go like, there's this guy who's like you, but I see him walking, and you get that all the time. That's another thing.
Yeah, most definitely. And that came through that. But also appreciating it can be really difficult to explain incomplete spinal cord injury. And then just going back to the journalist, unless a journalist has had any experience, how are they going to get their head around that when they have to turn the story around in 5 hours? But it was really interesting. I spoke to a journalist who actually did 2 articles on spinal cord injury. And I thought both of these articles were really good. And his motivation for doing them was because he saw them as life-changing events, which could happen to any one of us. It doesn't have to be a spinal cord injury that can change your life. Anything could happen in your life and derail it in some way or put you on a different path. So I thought that was a really lovely message. But in the article, he mentioned complete paraplegia, which really struck me because you don't see that very often. And when I asked him about it, he said it's because the person that he interviewed he was describing himself as complete paraplegia. And then he asked, he goes, oh, what does that mean, mate? You know? And so it brings me back to, I started to think about, well, how is it that people with spinal cord injury describe themselves? You know, that language, you know, for example, describing yourself as paraplegic, or do you have paraplegia? Even those little differences, do you label yourself as your spinal cord injury, or do you just say that you have paraplegia? Does that make, you know, the subtleties between the two? Because I know in the hospital system, we're very quick to say, oh, yeah, there are 3 paraplegics down in rooms 6, 7, and 8. And so there's very quick to label people according to their injury. But you don't necessarily see that in other health conditions, like an amputee, for example. I was thinking about it over the weekend. I guess a person, do they say I'm an amputee? I don't know. what's a person with a head injury? I don't think a person with a head injury actually says I'm head injured, or
And is there,
oh,
are you liking it? It's Georgina here.
oh, so
Are you, I'm just thinking of the similarities of when we talk about disabled people, or a person with a disability, or a person with paraplegia, or a paraplegic.
yeah,
So it's like, as you said, it's whether you're giving yourself that title already, or describing that person with a particular issue that they have.
yeah, and that language, like we can bring it person with disability or disabled person. In Australia, we tend to say person with disability. We put the disability person first, but in the UK, it's the other way around. And there's pros and cons for that. And I can see the rationale for both. But I think for me, not having a disability, it's not for me to say what's right or wrong. It's the person. You know, we can all describe ourselves whichever way you like. But I think I just want to make sure that when people have a new injury, they're really open or have been exposed to the different ways that you might be able to describe yourself, because automatically people might be saying to them, and the word suffering, that comes up a bit in the interviews that I've done. Oh, you've suffered a spinal cord injury, you're suffering with spinal cord injury, and not everyone likes that. And whilst there might be some truth in that at some point, you know, all of it, every day we can have ups and downs, but maybe someone doesn't want to be described as suffering every day. But then what's the alternative word? And it's maybe giving people the opportunity. It could be sustained. It could be that you've had a spinal cord injury, and not quickly pigeonholing the narrative into certain words and giving people different options.
At AQA, we sort of taught quite a while ago to name the person, and then living with.
Yeah.
That sort of language, that rolls just so much better and respectful, and how people want to be trained, I suppose.
Leanne,
Yeah.
Sorry, Pete, you finished?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, a very wise man, his name was Portrayed, said to me, and I always remember this, he says, see the person, not the disability. And whenever people ask me, you know, what's wrong, I say I have an impairment. Because the unfortunate thing that when people think that you've got a disability, it's such a broad spectrum of things that they don't have a clue what it means. So they just pigeonhole you into a certain place. But when you say, hey, I've got an impairment, they have to think about it for a while, and then they sort of like ask for you to redefine that to them, which then gives them a better insight into your particular situation.
I think talking to kids also changes. It's much easier to say to a child, my legs don't work, and not use the paraplegia or paraplegia. I mean, I certainly prefer to say I have paraplegia, but I have to pull myself up at times because I was certainly raised up with, don't talk to that, you know, that paraplegic, leave that paraplegic alone. And I think there's a lot of language that hospitals should change in well, not so much preparing people. I've never heard an inpatient talk about their discharge date. They only ever talk about going home. And yet the rest of the hospital focus on discharge date.
Mm.
And I think it's a good example of how we medicalise everything. Just thinking about what you were asking, Leanne, because you know, even mental health conditions and diabetes, you know, some people describe themselves as diabetic, others, I have diabetes. So the medicalisation of disability, I think, has played a big part in the way people get labelled with their condition, rather than they are a person with this condition, but that's not the whole person. That's just a part of who they are. And then in media, it becomes shorthand because it takes up less copy space. I remember back when I was working at Scope and really trying to pick up on the disability awareness stuff and trying to introduce the change in language from disabled and to people with disabilities, and you know, talking to was a journalist in a local paper and trying to get them to write people with disabilities, and they said, well, I'll write it, but my editor might change it back because it takes up less word, less space. So there's even, you know, things like that kind of impact. But you're right too, that I think it has to come, has to be a movement that comes from the people that live with the experience to rewrite it.
Yeah, and another example is in the field of cancer. It came up in conversation in a few interviews I did this year, was the words that are around, for example, battling cancer or survived cancer, fighting cancer. And what does that mean when someone then dies from cancer? They lost the battle, and it puts it on them. And it's kind of like, well, it's not their fault that they've died from cancer, but all of a sudden it creates this ownership. And I had an auntie who had a sudden diagnosis of cancer earlier in the year, and I was just put into this situation where all of a sudden I didn't know what words I wanted to use to describe. And when I was talking to my cousin, I instantly went, oh yeah, she can fight this. And then I've internalized that comment. I'm going, but hold on a moment, I don't think she can, because it was quite aggressive. But then I didn't know what other words to use. And it's because, again, we just see those words used so often with cancer that becomes the quick default. And then it was interesting that this came up in the interviews I did this year. And so I think it's probably with a few health conditions that there are some default words that are used. And that's when journalists are working quickly, they just think, oh yeah, we'll just write that because it's a guarantee to hook people in if we use suffering, for example.
And therefore it'll get past the editor.
Yeah. And then it get in the paper the next day. But the New South Wales Cancer Council, they've got a information page around language, and it's targeted at people with newly diagnosed cancer, just saying, look, you may not know what right words to use to describe your situation right now, but here are some tips, here are some words. And I just thought that was actually quite nice. Gives people the option rather than automatically going with what everyone else is saying, which is just because that's what media say. So some food for thought there, I think, of maybe drawing on some of those resources.
Leanne?
Yes.
If I'm ever in a situation where, well, and it's happened quite often over the years, you know, what's wrong with you, what happened to you type of thing, I would never say, I broke my neck. Oh yeah, my brother broke his back. Oh yeah, my uncle broke his neck. The only way to put it that people understand it, if you're in the situation where it's appropriate to go a little bit further, I just say I had a spinal cord injury, and that gets them thinking, you know. And then they might ask, well, what's a spinal cord injury? Well, I broke my neck, damaged my spinal cord. That's where all the nerve transmissions are. And they're usually happy with that. They either don't know and it confuses them, or they're totally happy.
But it creates some curiosity, and that was something that came up this year as well, that if people are generally curious, and obviously they asked you the question, so they've got a certain degree of curiosity just to ask you first up. But I think by then offering them something that is maybe a bit unexpected, it's really nice, because all of a sudden you've added that extra layer of information that they otherwise may not have received. So you're kind of doing some educating at the same time.
And I find that spinal cord defines it specifically, rather than I broke my neck.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great example. I'll just take you back to the end, I guess the conclusion to that study where I interviewed people with the spinal cord injury. So it really led to the idea that people with spinal cord injury believe that there are these polar narratives. It creates this misunderstanding, and then as a result, they're getting unreasonable expectations and assumptions. Majority of people that I spoke to really felt, and I think Mario, you touched on it, that media are not going to change. They're always going to sensationalize a story. There's always going to be the extremes. And I think when you compare it to able-bodied people, at least we see more able-bodied people in between. Not everyone is on a pedestal and not everyone is pitied. We do see greater diversity of that in between. But when it comes to people with disability or people with spinal cord injury, it's just absent. There's just nothing. It's improving, I must say. I think it's certainly improving. But so it's not, weren't really concerned with the polar narratives. It was trying to fill that gap with better other portrayals to show the diversity that exists, offer some different narratives and language to really ensure that people aren't pigeonholed in one or the two, because there will always be the overachievers, and there will always, I think the people I spoke to also really wanted to highlight that the experience of trauma is real when you first have a spinal cord injury. And so you don't want to take that away from anyone either. It's just unfortunate that media gravitates to that. And then, sorry, it's a little bit noisy in here, but unfortunately that's then just carried over to people assuming that's your life experience when that's not true.
Even to the point when they do marketing, like for a wheelchair or apparatuses, they always use actors sitting in a wheelchair or whatever that is, and they're selling it to us, but we can pick that straight away.
Yeah, and that's where this idea of absent, even when you are in there, it's not even really you, it's an actor. Yeah.
Leanne, I know this is slightly off your topic, but even the like the TAC advertisements and so on, I think there was that kind of paradox that they create of highlighting how tragic spinal cord injury to try and prevent it, but then it doesn't really highlight that people can have a really good positive quality of life. Did that come up in your discussion at all? How?
So, sorry, not so much so, but I know that it's a really interesting I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but a situation where insurance companies are in, because obviously they want to prevent injury from happening. And what's the best way to prevent something? You put fear into people, but then how does that help people then live with that condition? And I know that there used to be some very horrible advertisements that TAC would bring out that really didn't help people who were then living with spinal cord injury or disability. I haven't seen so much in recent times, but it's a very fine balancing act on how it is that they would do their kind of marketing in that space. I think I would love to talk to the comms team at TAC. I think it's a really interesting.
I guess, Leanne, it's
area.
horses for courses. They're designing a program designed to prevent people from becoming quadriplegics, and they must do that. I think that's really important that they do that, because there's nothing more speaks to a young man than a person of a young man in a wheelchair, sure. But then the onus is put onto us, being like the AQA and other organizations, like, peer group organizations, to put out the good images. I think the AQA does a good job with that. There's videos with Georgina himself and a few other people, Duke, about, normal people doing normal things. And I think the onus is on us more than us, worrying about how we are portrayed in the media. We should go on the front foot and portray ourselves the way we like to see ourselves.
Yeah. Can I just say something, Leanne? The real thing is that when people see us, they see us in a wheelchair. they don't understand why we're in a wheelchair. And if they're the sort of person that's curious, they then try to find out why you're in the wheelchair. But we actually look like a normal person, but we've got a spinal cord injury. And so they're trying to figure out in their heads, well, this guy's in a wheelchair, so he's different to me in some way. So, and you almost need them to be curious rather than say, oh, well, you know, you're in a wheelchair because something has happened to you, and not take it any further. I'd much prefer someone to say, oh, you're in a wheelchair, you know, and ask for possibly an explanation why you're in a wheelchair. Mm-hmm. And that's when you can go into the point of giving definition to the reason why you're in a wheelchair. And then you can understand as to whether you're losing them by talking about an SCI, or that, you know, you start off, hey, I've suffered a trauma of some way, and so therefore this has changed my mobility, only my mobility. And then they see that you can talk.
I think that's what you mentioned about differences, Duke. Did anyone watch the show last week on SBS, What Australia Really Thinks?
Yep.
It was
with Kurt. Yeah.
Yeah. What did people think of it?
Yeah, I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. I've actually almost watched it twice. I just haven't had a chance to.
It was very powerful, I thought, and I really liked that. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but it just the last section, they had people without disability watch some person with disability on the screen, and they spoke out loud about some assumptions they'd make about that person. And then they heard the real story, and then they got to meet them and realized actually they've got a fair bit in common. And it really brought me back to my own studies around how people said that people will wrongly assume things about them, and automatically people will go to the differences, and yet you won't explore what it is that you would actually have in common first, which I think is what we should all be looking for, what we have in common first rather than what we have different. I mean, visually we could see that there's something different, but I actually think, I mean, all of us here, we would no doubt have something in common to talk about that would hopefully outside of spinal cord injury. But that was a really powerful segment, and it really resonated with my studies that there are these assumptions and they're just wrong or incorrect. And maybe there is a small part of them that's true. That's okay. But I think on the whole, it doesn't help, and we need to demystify some of those stereotypes that have been around for years and years and years.
Yeah, Leanne, what I got out of the show was this. When I go around in my wheelchair, people are always offering, or if I ask for assistance, most people give it. And the difference is that I think people don't see, particularly men, fairly big men like myself, as being threatening because we're lower down than them. And so in asking for help, they don't feel threatened in being able to give it to you. But when you've got an upstanding person that may have a disability, may not also always be a physical disability, that they feel threatened. And when I saw that show, people were running away from them rather than helping them. I'm thinking, wow, I haven't really experienced that, but I can understand that now.
You're muted, Leanne.
Sorry. Yeah, the experiences can be different. So that was last year's project where I interviewed people with spinal cord injury. And so what was really lovely was to see that it matched with the newspaper analysis that people with spinal cord injury definitely felt that there's these polar narratives. And it was really great to understand what the impact was, because up until that point, I kind of knew that there was a negative impact, but I didn't know in what way. And so it was really great to hear that. So now it's like, okay, we do have a problem here and we need to try and fix it. But how am I going to fix it? So that's been this year's project, where I've interviewed 10 journalists and 10 sources. So they're people that I identified that would have provided information to the media about spinal cord injury. So I'm in the process of analysing all the interview transcripts at the moment, and it's been a really fantastic process to go through. I'll give you a little sneak peeks of what I've found, but at the moment, as media works so fast and they work on a range of topics, and with the 10 journalists that I interviewed, I had 2 sports journalists, 1 health science and technology. I had 2 lifestyle, another health. So they were from a range of different beats, but they all had written maximum of 2 stories on spinal cord injury in their career. You know, some of them spanning a career of 40 years. So how is it they're going to get the fine details right when they're just writing 1 story? So that, to me, put things into perspective from the view of the journalist. And they do rely heavily on the source and the subject that they're talking to. And an example of this was one of the journalists spoke about how he initially wrote the story as wheelchair bound. This person was wheelchair bound. And that's not because the subject actually spoke in that language, but that was, actually, I don't know how the subjects actually spoke. But anyway, it wasn't until he then spoke to someone who worked in the field and they were using the term wheelchair user. And he's gone, oh, hold on a moment, maybe wheelchair bound's not the right term. And so it's really kind of the closer you can get to some people who actually understand the topic, the better, the more likely you are to get it right. So I thought that was really important. But then sources. And so when I was looking at, so I approached all the different peer agencies in Australia, universities that do research in spinal cord injury, and I did have a good mix. I spoke to 3 comms people from different peer agencies in Australia and spoke to 2 comms people from university. But it's the university stuff that gets the profile, and that's all the research that sits behind Cure. Everyone thinks that's a lot more media sexy than some of the other stories. And so it's really, I'm now really starting to piece together why it is that we're seeing that the stories that we are. And then with this information, hopefully we can look at some sort of action that can help us figure out how we can make change. But then by then I would have finished my PhD, so I've run out of time. No, I never started this PhD just for it to finish with nothing. I really want to make sure that there's a product of sorts, so that'll be next year's project.
Those 2 on that, Leanne, there's been a couple of, I've just sort of picked them up, but especially the ABC, they've got reporters with a disability themselves. There's one that's been on quite a few times with spinal cord injury, and there's been another lady who's blind, I think, and they're not identified as a reporter with a disability, which is really good.
Yes, yeah. Charles Bryce in Adelaide, he does the ABC Breakfast, and Naz Capanella. So she was on Triple J for a long time as the newsreader, and then has gone on to become the disability specialist reporter for the ABC. And yeah, which is fantastic, you know, both to have them visually on the screen. And it's neither of their jobs is about them having a disability, although you could say Naz is a bit, but you could also advocate, well, if you're going to have a person who specifically reports on disability, it's only fair that they have one. But yeah, but certainly for the one that Charles does, he's just a reporter that happens to have a spinal cord injury. And I think they're the kind of portrayals that people are wanting. They want, you know, the person to be first, and then the fact that they've got a spinal cord injury is kind of the second. Often people would use, you know, I just want to be watching Neighbours, and there just happens to be a character with spinal cord injury. And there used to be one on Home and Away, and then he got fixed.
Leanne, did you consider the way that there's certain movies that have got people with spinal cord injury in them? Some high-profile ones.
Yeah, they came up in conversation. I decided the film Me Before You. I think that came up a lot. The one that people enjoyed the most is the French one.
The Untouchables.
Yes, yeah. People spoke quite fondly of that one. And I kind of, it was, whilst it was included, I've kind of kept to media news reporting rather than looking at the entertainment industry, because I think that becomes a bit separate, but I think it needs to be addressed most definitely. But I think we're slowly seeing more diversity. Like I know on Netflix, there was a show, Sex Education. I'm not sure if anyone's seen that one. There's a character in that with spinal cord injury. Has nothing to do with his spinal cord injury. He's just a character on the show. I think there's a couple, certainly with autism, it's featuring a bit more in media as well. A lot of people spoke fondly of the Love on the Spectrum and how it's really, I was a bit conflicted with that show. Has everyone seen that one? So people with autism or autistic people. So that's something I learned. People with autism like to be called autistic, so autistic person. So that's different to disability. Now, I didn't know that until I was interviewing someone who mentioned it. And so again, and actually it was the reporter was talking around the challenges on how language can change. Like in PTSD, for example, apparently now they like to drop the D and now it's just PTS, but I don't know. But I'm thinking, gosh, yes, it must be really hard to stay on top of it all, hence putting the reliance on the source. But sorry, Jeff, go. I'm up in conversation, an angle that I've taken on my study. Yeah, so that's where I'm at with my study. So I've got just a year to go. And as I said, I'll be wrapping up the project I've done this year. And then next year, really thinking about, well, how can it translate now? But I think from the peer group, I'm really interested to know more about what is the language that's that people use. And I'd love to talk about that further if there's a chance, because I think ultimately it comes down to how the person describes themselves. And because if the journalist, if they're talking to a source and they're talking about themselves in a certain way, why would a journalist think any different? So I think that would be an interesting area to explore a bit more.
I think it boils down to the individual as to how they take the way that they're described as well. I mean, I sometimes I don't get too fussed about stuff like that. I've even been known to call myself a cripple, but you know,
and I think that's okay. Like I for sure, any one of us can use any words that we want to, but I think when that's taken as gospel and it's assumed for the wider group, then that's when it probably becomes a bit problematic. And when something lands in mainstream media, I think there is an assumption, well, that's how these are the words that are used. So that's my take on it anyway.
Sometimes I think the world's so politically correct, people are afraid to say anything in case of offence these days.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even know what the current LBGT letters, because they keep changing. They add an extra letter every time I hear about it, you know. So
I think it's respecting that community as well.
Yeah.
Like if as a collective, people with spinal cord injury were wanting to advocate for something for a different language, you would just hope that other areas of the community would respect that, even if it was a bit challenging. Because I think that's the only way that we can all work together.
Yeah, I think that's the essence. I think what you said before is ask the source how they would like to be referred and refer to people. So before you refer to anyone, ask them how they're going to be. And the other thing is intent. Your intent comes clearly out in writing and in speaking. if you call someone a cripple accidentally, you don't mean it, you've been in the best possible way. It comes across in normal. It's only in print that it doesn't. But when people address you and they're talking to you, sometimes people say the most awful things to you in the most nicely intended way. But you get that. You get the context, you know? It's just in the print that it's a bit difficult.
And I think that's a good example, Mario, of why it's important that we do think about these things, and that we are, you might describe it as political correctness, Jeff, but I think it forces us to think a little bit more. And I keep going back to the slide we have in our training where we says we've got 2 ears for listening and one or 2 holes for listening and 1 hole for talking, and that we should listen twice as much as we speak. And I think some of the stuff that encourage us to stop and think, and maybe am I messaging right? Am I understanding this person's experience correctly? Is important for us as an enlightened society, that we continue to evolve that way.
Can I just say something, Sal? Very important. I know I'm talking too much, but the exact difference in what Jeff and you are saying is the word politically. You should be always endeavoring to be correct. Being politically correct means you're just doing it for a reason of being political. Whereas if you try and be correct from the point of being correct, then that's the nice way to be, you know? You'll get it right every single time. Being politically correct implies you're only doing it for a reason of being correct on a superficial level. But I think we should be correct in the way we address each other, and correct in the way, we go about wanting to address each other.
Yeah, but one person's correctness is not always the same as someone else's.
It only depends on the 2 people who are interacting.
Yeah, but doesn't it come, Mario, familiarity with a rapport that you have with somebody?
Well,
but you need to establish that. But it's the first time of contact that's where a lot of the problem is. And so I think, Leanne, as you're saying, is from the onset, if you're talking to somebody, get definition of how they'd like to be referred to as, and then you don't have to group pigeonhole somebody, I suppose is the way of saying it. Do you think, isn't that about right, Mario? Do you agree with that?
Well, you're saying what I was sort of saying is that each interaction is a separate paradigm. So my interaction with Jeff, we could call each other cripples, and we'd be fine with that. But if we went to another paradigm with someone new or a person who's not injured, we wouldn't use that sort of phraseology, because that would give that person, like Leanne said, the wrong idea, and would sort of legitimize the use, because they go, hang on, if he's calling himself a cripple, maybe all people in chairs call themselves cripple. So we just got to be mindful of what the specific situation is in which we're communicating.
Yeah, the context.
Yeah.
I joke with my nephew when I was taking him out shopping, and all of the car parks were taken, and I would say, oh, all the Crips are out today, and we'd laugh about it. And then he related a story like that, and he used the word Crip with some of his schoolmates, and then they're all, oh, you can't use that word, that's terrible, and because it was just out of context.
Yeah.
It was, yeah.
I have to go, so hopefully that's okay.
Thank you, Leanne. I think
that was good.
It's been great.
Yeah.
Yes, Leanne, thank you very much.
No, thank you. And I'd love to come back and talk again sometime. And if there's any other questions or any reflections afterwards, feel free to contact me, or happy to chat about it anytime.
Just one before you go, Leanne. Did it come out like when people are talking about disabilities, that we are seen as the professionals to talk about any disability, like we're the expert in CP and MS and ABI?
Good question. I think, again, it's the context of the conversation.
Yeah.
If it's the experience of disability, I mean, you might argue as a wheelchair user, it might be different to someone who's got autism, who is walking around, has more of a cognitive effect. So I think it's the context of that information that you're sharing. And again, you don't want to assume that your experience is the same as theirs. Yeah, I haven't really thought about, I think it comes down to the topic, but if you're ever asked to make comment and you're not sure, it's being clear about that. Like, I can only reflect on my experience, or I can only reflect on the experience of people with spinal cord injury. And then whoever you're talking to has to take that away and hopefully be able to apply it in the right way.
And that's a rule of thumb even within peer support, that your experience of spinal cord injury is different to somebody else's. So it's very tricky when we start to generalize and assume that your own personal experience or knowledge is going to apply to everybody and every situation. So yeah, I think,
you know what, it's actually quite profound to me, a number of conversations with different people in doing this, is the differences that people make between congenital disability and acquiring disability. And I, as a physio, I would never, I mean, I know the differences between the two, but I wouldn't ever treat anyone differently because of the two. And I don't actually see them as any different. Yet there are people that will really want to make a point that their disability was acquired. They weren't born with it. And I think that's really interesting. I've been quite confronted with that, actually, because it never even dawned on me that there was there is a difference, but in society that there needs to be a difference. And you don't often see people with, we do see people with congenital disability in media, but
I think that gets tied up with the whole intellectual disability bit as well, though, Leanne. I think having worked at Scope, that was kind of I think what happened. It wasn't just that it was seen as a physical disability. It was tied in with intellectual disability as well, and so an acquired disability seems to be portrayed as just a physical disability. And people with ABI are people with behaviour challenges. So there's all these kind of, levels to it, which people don't want to be identified to.
Exactly, it's got many sides to it. It's that and a lot more. What's important to that person? Yeah. Again.
Anyway, thank you, Leanne.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thanks for listening. Really lovely hearing your thoughts, and hopefully catch up again soon. Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Hey, before everybody goes, and given that this is a professional development session for you as peers, I just wonder whether people are okay about maybe just having a think about what did you get out of Leanne's presentation, and what you might take, what you might use in your interactions with peers, or what's your learning, what's your takeaway for today that might be helpful as a peer support.
Do you want to talk about that now, or?
Yeah, I was just thinking we could go around the screen, and feel free to pass if you don't want to. We're
going to keep recording, so.
What's that?
Going to keep recording.
Yeah, if people are happy for me to keep recording, I think that would be good. So in no particular order, and I've noticed some people have dropped out already, but let's start with Pradeep. Any takeaways for you?
Yes. Yes, Al, why don't we can put the disability to the school to teach about the disability, then we can change all.
Okay, so yeah, so I guess your takeaway is about better education in schools and
yes,
in general. Yeah. Okay, great. Georgina?
Can you hear me okay?
Kind of.
Very, very low.
Very low?
Yeah.
What about now?
A bit better.
Okay. got out of the session was that, first of all, I was basically out. I could not believe the media back in the 1970s and 80s. And what I'm thinking nowadays in the media is that they're looking for something that's going to attract a viewer, whether it's something really inspiring or something really tragic. And like as Leanne mentioned, there's no in between. But then I was thinking, would the media want to report on something that's in between and normal, which is what we're trying to portray ourselves as normal, you know, everyday living people. So that's what the media does. They want a story, and so it's either really, really good or really something really, really bad. So yeah, it's a bit tricky, but it's something like Pradeep mentioned. The community needs to be educated, and even just thinking about me being out in the street and all the neighbours seeing me go up and down. I use the road. It's a quiet road. Educating people. There's a lot of kids around, and so they're getting familiar seeing someone in a wheelchair, and it's normal to them. So it's just about normalising spinal cord injury or disability. So yeah, I think we've got a fair way to go. But yeah, we need the media to help.
Okay, thanks. Jeff?
I thought it was interesting that last we were talking about where you ask somebody how they would like to be described, rather than just sort of, even though we're supposed experts, still doesn't mean that we know the way that somebody's going to like to be, you know, described.
Yeah.
When you're communicating with them, or when they're written about. Because I mean, I'm not all that fussed. I get more upset being called a paraglider pilot from the past than when I used to fly hang gliders, you know. But I don't mind if somebody calls me a paraplegic. It doesn't bother. I know that I'm not, but
yeah. So that notion of tuning into what the person would like.
Yeah, some people are very touchy about how they're put out there.
Thanks, Jeff. Duke, what's your takeaway?
I think very much what, like Pradeep was saying, it's an awareness thing. What our perception, how we perceive the person who we're having a dialogue with is very, very related to the words we use, and to make sure that when we're having that dialogue, that they see that we're using the how they define themselves, not how we want to define them, but in being able to communicate with them using their terminology, I don't know, to improve dialogue and understanding of other people. It doesn't matter if they've got disabilities or not. It just find out. And I like your one about we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Just listen to what they say and then channel that into what they're going to be hearing.
Thanks, Duke. Gary?
Yeah, well, I was pretty much going to say the same as Duke finished up with. I love the two holes for listening and 1 hole for talking. Duke's talking about dialogue with people. And I guess we're taking this backwards. We're talking about ourselves and the way we handle it with our peers. But I guess that's the only way we could really look at it, because how somebody perceives me doesn't particularly worry me. I mean, it never has. If I'm in my wheelchair, they think, you know, well, he's paralysed or he's had an accident or something. If I'm hobbling along with 2 walking sticks, it's either hip replacement or knee replacement or something like that. So it doesn't matter unless we're personally involved with the conversation. And I agree that once you don't try and impose your thoughts upon somebody that you're speaking to as a mentor. You're just in open conversation, and little bits and pieces come in, and you proceed along those lines, and you're both thinking in exactly the same direction, and you just continue that way, and almost try and get them to lead you, and then you can help where you think it's necessary that you could put something in there for them.
Great, thanks, Gary. Jack.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting, that. The inspiring or tragedy bit and nothing. I look at people actually think just the fact that you got out of bed and you got in your chair and got out in the community is pretty inspiring some days for a lot of people. When you look at bloody Josh over there, that's extra inspiring. But the other thing about that too is all the different levels of bloody disability in the spinal cord injury world. Every vertebrae makes a difference, and even just watching the wheelchair rugby, the average person out there doesn't realise that they're quadriplegics. Everyone looks at the Paralympics and thinks they're all paraplegics, and it's something that it just needs a bit more learning, and the media should probably play a bigger part in that.
Cool, thanks, Jack. Mario, what's your takeaway?
But I've said quite a lot, but I think that for me, the thing I realized from her is that in the way we address each other gives other people legitimacy to address our community using the same language. Yeah, because we can use things amongst ourselves, but when we use it in public, people can then think it's okay to say things like what we're saying in jest. They don't get the context.
Thanks, Mario. Hui, are you there? Your camera's off. What about Susanna? You're there, but you're also muted. Do you have a takeaway?
Yeah, I do. I have a takeaway.
Yep.
I think Leanne did a wonderful job in expressing all avenues of how and people perceives us in wheelchairs, and I think also it's given me a way of what other people actually may be thinking when they look at me. So it's widened my view to not be so feeling like it's not a tragic loss. It's okay to perceive it as, this has happened to me, but life still goes on.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I think it was a great presentation of, how the media back in the 1940s and people like that were talking about, we were nothing, and, they didn't expect us to come out of our beds or survive. So that was very interesting to know that back then. And I think now that we've come such a long way, there's, I think people do realise that when they do see us in wheelchairs and they say, they sometimes not afraid to ask questions. And if you give them, an answer that they can understand, that you're widening their perspectives as well.
Great. Thanks, Susanna.
No problem.
Naz, do you have a takeaway?
Yeah, just I think it comes down to education, so, with the media, or especially the media plus ourselves as well. They were talking about that reporter who used the term wheelchair bound, I think, because that was a term that was commonly used years and years ago. But after he spoke to someone, that actually had that disability, they told them what the term should be. So it's the reporters being educated, and I think the reporters, I mean, if they're presenting a story, they're the ones that need to be doing their research in the first place. So terms like that shouldn't come about anyway. So wheelchair bound should never be used anyway, especially in these days, because they need to educate themselves about the article. I mean, it's their story, so the language, they have to be sure about what language they're using as well.
Thanks, Naz. Pete?
There's a couple of things. First thing that I really liked and resonated with me was how just not spinal cord injury people or disability, just community sometimes looks for difference where we shouldn't be looking at difference. We've got a lot in common, you know, about that visual difference. So we should be thinking about what we have in common and then seeing what that is and then relating to each other better, you know, in that sense, rather than looking at the difference and pointing out the difference or talking about difference. But what's in common is more important. Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah, it's sort of, I think I'll take that with me a bit, just the way I think of AQA, of how we can present ourselves as an organisation, you know. What do we have in common with our community and use that more? You know, not think about difference. Yeah. Another thing I thought was really good was Mario's take on political correctness, and just it taught me to say, you're dead right, it is correctness. And also with Jeff saying that the PC world sometimes, and I get that, because we don't want to offend, we don't want to say the wrong thing, and that's where it gets caught up a bit of time. So, but just talking about it more and seeing where that respect needs, seeing how that person wants to be spoken to or about or addressed, that's all it takes. So, you know, and that's where the correctness lies. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Pete. And Lynn?
I've got a couple of things as well. I want to reiterate what Pete was saying in the terms of finding out our commonalities rather than our differences. And my takeaway is kindness, I think. And kindness is sometimes forgiving people when they use the wrong language. Kindness is finding the commonalities that we have with people. And I've been reflecting while we're sitting here how every community is trying to have their voice heard at the moment. You know, people with spinal cord injuries, people from refugees, people, there are just so many. And I think if we are kind and try and find the commonalities that we share, I think that puts us on a positive path. And that's the one that we should be trying to take.
That's great. Lynn, I feel like we should almost end on that.
We haven't given Jeff a say, I think.
What's that?
Have we given Jeff a say?
Yeah, we did.
Oh, sorry.
We did give Jeff a say. It's only me. So I'm happy to just end it on Lynn's, because I think she summed it up nicely. I will say that, Mario, that your response to the idea that you know, we see able-bodied people portrayed in the media across the whole spectrum, whereas with people with spinal cord injuries, they're either a tragic figure or an inspirational figure and nothing in between, and that we should project ourselves in the way we want to be seen. And I shouldn't be saying we, because I'm not part of that we, but I think you know what I mean. So just being out there, and I think having worked in the field of disability, the more that people with disabilities engage in community life, the more community begins to understand the experience of each person, and finding that commonality was the other thing that really spoke to me. So I think Lynn's lovely summary of kindness, forgive people who misspeak, forgive ourselves, I'll add, and finding commonality is probably the really nice, the takeaway messages for me. So thanks, everybody. Are there any other final comments before we'll stop the recording?
One thing I was thinking of when who was it? Duke was talking about that show where the guy with cerebral palsy was trying to ask directions and people were running away from him. Some cultures around the world tend to hide away their disabled people, and you might find that some of those, the girls, for example, they were either from a culture where they're not used to having people with disabilities around them, and they're scared of something different, or maybe they're just scared of men, trying to rip them off or attack them or whatever. Could have been the reason. It might not have been the disability itself that they were running away, but yeah.
I agree with you there, Jeff. That is a possibility. But there was a guy who was pushing a rubbish bin.
Yeah, that was pretty bad, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that was pretty bad. But one of the interesting things about that show was, do you see yourself as inspirational? I'm not asking for an answer to that. In this show, they were asking people who had disabilities as to whether they were inspirational. And most of it answered was, no, I see that I am just living and people perceive it as being inspirational, but all I am doing is living my life after a spinal cord injury or an injury. And so it's all to do with how others perceive us. A lot of people see what we do as being inspirational because we seem to have a positive outlook in making things different or even better. But how we view ourselves is probably more important, and how we convey that to others, whether we see ourselves as inspirational or whether they see us as inspirational. That's, I don't know.
Thanks.
I think to a certain extent, every one of us are inspirational for the fact that we haven't given up and we've kept on going. A lot of people, when they're hit with some kind of a difficulty in their life, they just give up. So I think every one of us, no, it doesn't even have to be a disability. It could be a bankruptcy. It could be a spouse leaving or something like that. Yeah.
You're inspirational not because you have a spinal cord injury, but because you're resilient.
That's right. It's a resiliency.
Yeah.
To me, the word to inspire means that someone else will think differently or do something differently. So when people tell me that, they find me inspirational, I say, well, I'll only accept that if you now change and you now do something differently.
You're such a kind person, Lynn.
I reckon that's a really nice comeback to that.
It's awesome.
All right. Unless there's any other comments, I'm going to stop the recording. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.